Hey everybody, Jace Lyon here with Skills and Drills Baseball Training, and I'm back with another informative episode of On the Ball. Now, if you happen to catch my previous few episodes, I'm sure you know that we've already talked about how to improve your glove, how to improve your grip, and how to improve the alignment in your throwing motion. So I've already covered a decent amount when it comes to the defensive side of things. I figured today it'd be best to take some time and send out some offensive information. Now, obviously, since we're all locked down to the confines of our own home right now, I understand it's pretty much impossible for any players to get any form of live BP session in. So I'm sure that tees are getting used now more than they ever have before. Now, in my opinion, I think that the tee is the single most important tool when it comes to improving a player's hitting on the diamond. But that being said, if it's used incorrectly, it can also be the player's worst nightmare when it comes to his hitting performance on a diamond. So in today's episode, I wanted to cover the number one mistake that I see people making when it comes to using a tee, how that mistake's actually affecting that hitter's performance on a diamond, and the adjustment that you need to make in order to get the most out of your tee work at home. So let's start off by talking about the most common mistake I see people making when they're using their tee. And I know what you're thinking. How could I possibly make a mistake using a tee? I get the tee out, put the ball in the tee, player comes up, hits the ball off the tee. It's as simple as that. And when I say the word mistake, I don't necessarily mean how you're using the tee, but I'm referring to how you're positioning that tee in reference to the player's body. If you've never been exposed to hitting training before, you might be surprised to hear that there's actually a correct and an incorrect location of where you want to make contact with specific pitches. And what I mean by that is where I make contact with an inside pitch is a totally different location from where I want to make contact with an outside pitch. And those positions are determined by the player's ability to create consistent contact, the most power, and generate the best launch angle to increase his success on the diamond. So what I want everyone to understand is, when you're working from a tee, you're not just working on the player's bat path or his form of mechanics, but you're working directly with his point of contact. And so as that player takes hundreds and hundreds of reps off the tee, it's reinforcing in his mind the exact location that he should be making contact with that specific pitch. So if I want the player to reach his maximum potential in terms of his consistency, power, or the launch angles that he's generating off the bat, I need to make sure that when I'm working with the tee, I'm putting that tee in the proper position to reinforce the correct point of contact. So the most common mistake that I see people making when using a tee in terms of teaching the improper connection point is they treat the base of the tee as if it's home plate. So if a player sets up to the tee as if it's home plate, you're going to end up in a position that looks something similar to this. You're going to have a fastball that's coming down the middle of the plate, but it's shifted all the way back to that hitter's front hip, or sometimes even farther, closer to the center of his body. And unfortunately, that's a terrible position for that player to try to make contact with a ball that's over the middle of the plate. So, assuming that most of you are hitting this way, let's first go through and explain all the disadvantages of trying to make contact with a ball over the middle of the plate from this position. So the first disadvantage of trying to hit a ball that's over the middle of the plate this far back on the hitter's body is from this position, that hitter can't actually see the front of the baseball. And I know that sounds crazy, but I'll bring the camera around to kind of show you the angle from the hitter and show you what I'm talking about. But because that hitter cannot see the front of the ball, he can no longer determine where the center of that ball is. So even though connection from this position is hard enough, if the player is lucky enough to come in contact with the baseball, what we often find is that player is going to end up contacting the top or the bottom of the ball, which is going to lead to either a light grounder or a light pop-up. Both of those are going to be easy outs, and neither of them are conducive to driving in runs or boosting your batting average. In order to explain that point more clearly, I simply taped a note to the front of the baseball. So if we can see that front surface of the baseball, we can easily read that note. Now, if you notice, if we shift back to the position that the hitter's in, we can no longer read that note, and therefore we can no longer see the front surface of the baseball. And that's where those hitters have such a hard time trying to find dead center, and they end up hitting a lot of grounders or a lot of pop-ups. The next disadvantage I wanted to talk about is when the ball is over the center of the plate, but it's shifted that far back on the player's stance, it's almost impossible for that hitter to use the barrel to make contact with the ball. And that's going to affect his hitting in a number of ways. Number one, it's going to decrease the chance that he actually makes contact in the first place. And that's because from this position, when the bat comes around, we're no longer using that full 2 5/8 inch barrel. At this point, that bat has started to taper down into the handle. So there's a whole lot less bat coming through the zone at this location, and therefore, since there's less surface area of the bat to make contact with the ball, there's less chance that the player actually hits the baseball. Now, not only is it going to decrease his contact, but it's also going to decrease the amount of power that he can put on the ball. In order to generate the most amount of power possible, when using an aluminum bat, we want to hit as close to the sweet spot or the center of that barrel as possible. And the reason for that is the closer you can hit to the center of that aluminum barrel, the more that aluminum can actually flex, and when it reflexes, it adds more power, or what's referred to as pop, on the baseball. So from this location, I'm obviously hitting closer to the ends where that barrel cannot flex near as much, and therefore even if I am lucky enough to make contact at this position, I'm not going to have the maximum amount of power that I possibly could if I could comparatively hit that baseball in the center of the barrel. Another way that hitting a ball this far back in your stance decreases your power is because it decreases the amount of leverage that you're using at contact of the baseball. And the way that I want you to think about leverage is I want you to think about the difference between a hatchet and an axe. So if you think about a hatchet, it's in general a pretty short tool, maybe it's on a 20-inch handle. We're normally using it really close to our body, and we're using it for tasks that don't generally require a whole lot of power. So for instance, maybe we're chopping smaller limbs or we're processing smaller firewood down into kindling. Either way, we're not using that tool to generate a whole lot of force or power on whatever objects we're using it to cut. Now, if we take that exact cutting edge and we extend it out now on an axe handle, which is 30-some inches long, now because that tool is extended farther from my body, I'm able to generate a whole lot more force with it, so I can take that same cutting edge now on an axe handle and chop down an entire tree with it. And that same premise can be thought of when we're thinking about hitting. So in this case, when that ball is shifted back in my stance, I'm hitting in more of what would be the hatchet scenario, where I'm using a very short handle and I'm working really close to my body. From this position, I can no longer generate a whole lot of leverage, and therefore I can't generate the maximum amount of force that I possibly could if I was hitting in the axe scenario, where if I'm trying to hit a baseball with maximum power, ideally that hitter should make contact with fully extended arms and a fully extended barrel, and therefore he's hitting that baseball farther from his body and on that theoretically longer tool handle, and therefore he's able to generate an exponentially larger force out at extension than he can working close to his body on that short handle. The last disadvantage I wanted to talk about is when you're trying to hit a ball over the middle of the plate this far back in your stance, it pretty much makes it impossible for that player to generate any kind of lift or launch angle on the baseball. And the reason for that is, if the player's hands are set correctly, if you notice, when the ball's in this position, the hands are pretty much directly on top of the baseball. So if this player takes a direct path to the ball, it pretty much only leaves him with one option, and that's to hit the ball straight on top, which is going to generate a grounder every time. Now, if you're hitting off a tee a lot in this position, obviously that player knows, I don't want to just smack this in the ground, I want to start to generate some lift into the netting. And when that happens, the brain starts to come up with creative ways of how to generate lift. And that ends up leading to that player developing a lot of bad habits. So in this next segment, I just wanted to cover two of the most common bad habits that I see players coming to me with. And I believe a lot of those bad habits are developed by taking too much tee work from this position. One bad habit that can be caused by hitting off a tee in this position is the player ends up developing what I refer to as a negative in his swing. And what I mean by that is he begins his swing with the hand sliding backwards. And the reason why that happens is because his brain, again, is trying to figure out how to generate any kind of lift or launch angle on this baseball. Well, the only way that you can generate lift on a baseball is if the hands get behind and level on the baseball before they make contact. Then they're able to lift it at the end of the swing. So that player's brain figures out, well, if I just slide my hands back in the beginning, now I've created enough distance between the ball and my hands to then get level and on plane and create lift at the end. And yes, that's going to work if you're just hitting off a tee. But this motion here is going to be devastating by the time that player hits the diamond. The reason why this motion is so devastating to a hitter's performance on the diamond is because it increases the amount of time it takes that player to swing. Not only is he adding that extra step to the swinging motion, but now he's also increasing the distance between his hands and the baseball. And because he has to travel a farther distance, it takes him a longer time to get there. Now, as that player takes a longer time to swing, he's also allowing that ball a longer time to travel, which increases the likelihood that that ball ends up deep in his stance, and he's going to end up struggling with all the disadvantages that we just talked about. Where now the player can no longer see the front of the baseball, he's going to struggle with hitting with the barrel, and he's also going to lose all that extra free power that he could gain by hitting at extension and using the maximum leverage. So the only way that the player can combat this extra time that it takes him to swing is by starting that swing earlier in the process when the ball is farther away. And that ends up affecting his selectivity. Because that ball is farther away from him, it's a lot harder for that player to read. Is it a fastball? Is it a breaking ball? Is it going to be a ball? Is it going to be a strike? Should I swing or should I hold? So this extra motion, because it takes more time, not only does it increase the chance that the ball gets deep, but now that player is a lot more likely to take swings at some bad pitches, and that's obviously going to decrease his batting average. Another bad habit that can be caused by hitting balls from this position is that player will actually learn to drop his rear shoulder as he swings. And again, the reason for that is that player's brain is trying to figure out how to generate any kind of lift on the baseball. And the only way that he can generate lift is by getting the hands level behind the ball. So if he's not going to send his hands back, the only other way to bring his hands to the level of the baseball is by dropping that rear shoulder in the beginning of the swing. And obviously, this motion is going to affect his ability to hit on the diamond. Number one, in order to drop that rear shoulder, I pretty much have to move my entire torso, which is a lot of weight, which adds a lot of time to the swing. As it takes me longer to swing, the ball travels a longer distance, and I also lose that extra time that I could use to be more selective on what pitches I'm swinging at. Not only that, but it also affects my selectivity because every time I'm dropping that rear shoulder, my eyes have to move. And as a hitter, we're fully dependent on those eyes sending the correct information to the brain as far as where the pitch is located, timing the pitch, and if it's a fastball, a curveball, a ball, or a strike, and if you should swing. So as the eyes move, I'm obviously not getting the correct or as good as data as I possibly could as if my eyes were fully steady watching that baseball intently. The other way that this affects the player is as he drops that rear shoulder, now since his shoulders are no longer level to the ground, it's a lot harder for that player to stay level through the zone. Really what his hands want to do is swing up, and that's what leads to that early uppercut, which then the player ends up hitting those super tall, towering pop-ups, which are easy to catch, or if he just nips the front of the baseball, you end up with those weak grounders. In either case, it's most likely going to be an out. So now that you know all the reasons why you should never be taking reps off your tee from this position, let's talk about how you can properly place your tee from home. If you're not going to use the base of your tee as your theoretical home plate in order for the hitter to line up to, that means you're actually going to need a second home plate in order to do this correctly. So if you actually don't have a second home plate laying around your house, I have a couple options for you to create your own. One option is you can do something similar to what I did here, and I just took an old broken tee that was laying around, and I cut off the tee part, and I repurposed the base as a secondary home plate. Another option might be if you have a tee that has a base in the shape of home plate like mine, you can just take the base, put it down on some cardboard or construction paper, trace the outline, and then you can cut out a second home plate for you to use. If neither of those are options for you, you can always Google the dimensions of home plate and maybe head out to an unfinished garage floor surface or maybe out on your driveway and just use some tape to tape the outline of home plate. So now you have a plate for the player to line up to, and now you can use the tee as a totally separate entity. So now that we have home plate and a tee, let's talk about where we want to position that tee for a pitch that's coming down the middle. For a pitch down the middle of home plate, it seems like the sweet spot for the hitters is about 7 inches from the front of home plate. Now, a trick for you to do that is if you have a tee that's similar to mine that's already in the shape of home plate, if you just take the front of the base of that tee and put it right up against the front of home plate, that'll position that ball in that sweet spot about 7 inches in front of home plate. So as you can see, the position that I'm in now is totally different from where we started the video. When we started, we had this tee set deep in that hitter's stance, and that's what was setting him up for all the disadvantages that we talked about previously in the video. But now with that ball out in front of the plate, and therefore way out in front of the hitter, he's able to gain some of those advantages back. So let's briefly talk about what those advantages are. Number one, with that ball out in front of the player, now he can more easily see the front surface of the baseball. And because he can see the front of the baseball, it's more easy for him to determine where the actual center point of that baseball is. So before, where you were hitting that ball deep and you might have been glancing off the top or the bottom of the ball, now because you can see the center point, it's a lot more likely for that player to drive through the center of the ball and drive it back through the diamond instead of having those glancing light grounders or light pop-ups. Now, if you notice at the connection point, this player can also use the center of the barrel, where before, when that ball was getting deep and it was down the middle of the plate, we were hitting more on the tapered part closer to the handle where there was less bat. So now that at this connection point, the player can use the center of the barrel, he's not only using the thicker part of the bat, which increases the chance he actually makes contact, but now he's also using the sweet spot of the barrel, which is going to increase his power through the diamond. The last advantage that this hitter is going to gain is at full extension here, that player can use more leverage. Instead of hitting that ball deep with that short handle, or in theory, that hatchet, now that player is able to extend his arms, extend the bat, and hit with that theoretical axe, creating a whole lot more power even though he's the same player. So just by shifting that ball 7 inches out in front of the plate whenever you're doing tee reps, you're going to be able to pretty much revolutionize that hitter's ability to make contact and drive balls with power. Well, that's all I have for you today, guys. As always, I hope everybody learned something. If you like this material, give me a like. If you want to help me reach as many players, parents, and coaches as possible, please give this post a share. And remember to stay positive Stay healthy, stay on the ball. We'll see you next time.